Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a pretty wild animated story from the YouTube channel Hardtoons. It's all about one of the most chaotic school experiences you can possibly imagine. So let's just dive right in.
Right off the bat, the guy telling the story just nails it with this one line. This wasn't just a school, you know? It was a prison where students were basically serving time and their parents were the ones dropping them off at the gates every morning. So, every sentence in this prison, right? It all kicked off with this absolutely torturous journey. A daily ordeal that started way before the sun was even up. The first challenge? Just getting there. And, just like any good prison transport, this one had its own warden. A warden who seemed to get a real kick out of the misery of his inmates. But who exactly was this figure of authority? Well, it was the van driver, a man the kids all called Payachi, which is kind of like saying brother. And his van, which was ironically named Magic, wasn't famous for its speed. Oh no. It was famous for its magical ability to break down pretty much every other day. Okay, so this slide here really lays out the sheer dedication to misery. Our narrator was the first kid picked up at 5 a.m. for a school that didn't even start until 9. This kicked off what he called a 3 to 4 hour city tour just to collect every other kid. Add in the constant breakdowns and being dropped off last, and you can kind of see why he had this deep personal hatred for biogeology. So, you might be asking, why on earth would anyone put up with this every single day? Well, as it often happens in these kinds of stories, there was a very powerful, let's say, singular motivation. And that motivation had a name, Chameli. Turns out, his crush rode the exact same van. And just like that, the 4-hour commute from hell suddenly had a real purpose. So, he didn't leave this to chance. He had a full-on master plan. Since he was the first one on the empty van, he'd throw his bag on the seat next to him to save it. Then he'd pretend to be completely knocked out. Chameli was always the last one to get picked up, so the only seat left would be the one he saved. The final, crucial step? Wake up and act all cool and surprised, like it was just a happy accident. Absolutely genius. And this was literally what was going through his head. It wasn't just about the plan, it was all about the performance. You can't look too eager, right? When she shows up, you gotta act surprised, maybe even a little annoyed, before you casually let her sit down. The key, he tells himself, is subtlety. So after somehow surviving the van ride, the students would finally roll up late, only to be met by the real warden of this asylum. She wasn't known by her name. Oh no. Everyone just called her Dawn. She was the one in charge of the whole school, and she ran the place with an absolute iron fist. Just seeing her standing at the gates was enough to scare every single student. Dawn was, she was a total legend. Physically, she was short and wide, and weirdly enough, it seemed like she was actually getting shorter every year. She even had to stand up while driving her car just to see over the dashboard. But the craziest rumor, that she would sit on the school roof with a sniper rifle, picking off any student she caught doing wrongful activities. So, once you got past Dawn and inside the prison walls, you'd find this whole complex society had popped up. It had its own currency, its own social hierarchy, and it was all based on one simple thing. The entire foundation of this society was a game called pen fight. The rules were super simple. You use your pen to try and knock your opponent's pen off the desk. But the stakes, way high, because the winner gets to keep the loser's pen. It was basically high-stakes classroom gambling. And this table here, it just breaks down the entire class system perfectly. Your whole social status depended on the pen you had. At the very bottom, you've got your peasants with their cheap disposable pens. A step up, you have the commoners with those leaky gel pens. But the kings, the absolute top of the food chain, were the kids who owned a Trimax. That was the ultimate status symbol. And I am not exaggerating the importance of a Trimax. One time, a rich kid's Trimax went missing, and the entire school went into a full-blown lockdown. Every student was lined up, every single bag was searched, the whole place just ground to a halt over one stolen pen. And of course, where was it? It was later found at the kid's house. Of course, you can't have a prison without some pretty eccentric guards and, some totally unruly inmates. The teachers at this school were every bit as strange as the students they were supposed to be teaching. The teachers, for example, they didn't really go by their real names. They all had nicknames. Take the English teacher. They called him Chota Beam, which is the name of a super popular and really strong cartoon character.
The irony was, this teacher was incredibly short, and his favorite hobby seemed to be beating up the male students. I mean, his whole deal was just bizarre. He was so short, he had to literally jump to try and slap students, but he'd usually only get as high as their waists. It was like his salary was based on commission, with bonuses for injuries. And his teaching method? He would translate English sentences by just saying them again in different English. Just completely absurd. But the students, oh man, they were no better. The washroom was kind of their lawless territory, a place for total chaos and petty crime. So what do you think happens when two of these students meet up in the washroom? They steal the light bulb. Simple, makes no sense, but it just perfectly sums up the vibe of the student body. Their logic was basically, hey, we paid our fees, so we own the place. And it did not stop with light bulbs. Oh no. When the bulbs were gone, they stole the taps right off the sinks, they stole the soap, and then there's this, which is just horrifying. Some kids would actually eat the urinal deodorizer cakes because they thought they were some kind of mints. This quote really just ties it all together perfectly. There was this incredible sense of entitlement, this feeling that paying tuition meant they owned the principal, the teachers, everything. But here's the ultimate irony. Half of these students hadn't even paid their fees. This whole story is just a hilarious and honestly kind of terrifying trip down memory lane, isn't it? It really makes you think back to your own school days, which I'm sure were probably just as strange in their own way. So I guess that leaves us with one final question for you. Who was the weirdest teacher at your school?